Excellent. All right. Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining today's panel where we'll be discussing best practices around optimizing real-world data for external control arms. My name's Vera Muchai. I'm the head of trials and chief scientist here at Datavant, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. For those of you who are not familiar with Datavant, our mission is to connect the world's health data to improve patient outcomes. We provide technology that helps healthcare data users link data in a privacy-preserving manner, and that technology today is used across the largest real-world data ecosystem. Our clients use linked data to support a variety of use cases, and in particular for this audience, in clinical development use cases like external control arm creation and trial tokenization. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation today. We have a great group here. And to get us started, I'd like to have our guests introduce themselves and provide a brief background of their involvement in the real-world data space. Tom, would you like to kick us off?
Sure, thank you, Vera. My name is Tom Haskell, and I'm Global Head of Innovation for Data and Analytics at Kantar Health. As many of you may know, we were recently acquired by Cerner, and that will become formal in a few months. I drive new innovations around real-world data offerings, and one of these is around our services for external control arms. Over my 20-year career in healthcare, I've been focused in both the clinical and RWE space in many different roles. So this whole external control arm piece is very exciting because it really brings together the intersection of both those spaces. Back to you,
Thank
Vera.
you, Tom, and welcome.
Thank you.
Dan, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Sure, happy to do. It's nice to meet the group. I'm Dan Riskin. I'm the CEO of Verantos. As many of you know, Verantos is a specialized real-world evidence firm focusing on high validity studies. We typically will integrate deep phenotyping from the electronic health record, artificial intelligence, linkage, pharmacy claims, facility claims, registries to create very highly valid studies for use in market access, regulatory, and clinical decision-making.
Thank you, Dan, and welcome. And finally, Aaron.
Hi, and thanks, Vera. Aaron Kamau. I'm a physician, medical informaticist, focused on this whole, what we refer to as real-world data today, clinical research informatics, and effectively how we leverage healthcare data to support across the drug development and value access continuum. I've had the opportunity to work in big pharma, small startup and entrepreneurial business, as well as big CRO. And in this particular context, have had the opportunity to run a synthetic control arm study where evidence was submitted to a regulatory agency and all the kind of challenges and lessons learned from that. And so excited to have this conversation and join this panel today.
Great, thank you, Aaron. So I'd like to get us started with a level setting question, but before I do so, we have quite a large group of attendees who have joined us today, and we want to make sure that this conversation is as interactive as possible. You'll see that there's a bottom Q&A box. We encourage the group to ask any and all questions that come to mind as we're having this conversation, and let's make this as real of a conversation and as real time of a conversation as we can, even within our Zoom constraints. So to get us started, we hear a lot of terms. You hear synthetic control arms, external control arms, natural history studies, prospective, retrospective data. Could you help the group define what an external control arm is? And Aaron, how about we start with you?
Yeah, great. So no, thank you for bringing that up. And frankly, I don't, within the industry, we really haven't come up with a standard nomenclature for this yet. External versus synthetic in particular, we hear and use both terms. Right now, I think largely interchangeably, though I think some of us may have slight differences in how we define that. I think at the end of the day, though, a couple of terms that really kind of jump out at us. External control arm is the term that has been used in FDA documentation. So that's something that we might start to hang our hat on a little bit there. And certainly, as you kind of already mentioned, things like natural history studies, I would even throw in there comparative effectiveness studies. There's kind of a spectrum upon which we can consider taking two cohorts of patient populations and comparing them to each other. And in this case, I think oftentimes when we talk about external control arm in FDA documentation, they kind of reference it as single arm clinical trials with an external control. In that particular use case, we're thinking of a patient level type comparison analysis where one cohort is a clinical trial arm. In particular, an arm of patients who are put on an intervention, and the other cohort is represented through other non-clinical, well, not necessarily non-clinical, could be retrospective historical clinical trial data or real world data. And at the end of the day, using this other external data source to serve as that patient level control. But I'll admit that's one kind of niche way to think about it. And it's probably more on a spectrum of use cases as we think more broadly about what we really mean when we talk about external controls.
Great.
Great.
So Dan, I saw you on mute. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that, so I agree with Aaron completely. Mostly when we talk about external or synthetic control arms, we're talking about a trial that uses as a control a non-traditional data set. The non-traditional data set may be real world evidence, so routinely collected data, or it may be other information from a different RCT. That's the most common view of a external or synthetic control arm. But I would challenge the group on this call to think more broadly. I give as an example an RCT where we were asked to help that the concern was it may not be powered for mortality. And the question was, can we augment a control arm? Most of the patients were assigned to the intervention arm. And the question was, can we use real world evidence to augment a control arm? And so I would ask, would the group view that as an external control arm? It's certainly an augmented control arm. Another example, we are running a registry right now on label similar patients using routinely collected data, EHR and linkage. And the question was, can we get a subset of patients that meet randomized trial criteria? So we have a trial similar group. And if we do, can we compare that against the actual trial data to show the validity of the study? And in this case, the RCT acts as an external control arm to the real world evidence study. So those are non-traditional uses of the term external or synthetic control arm. And I think we can think broadly that it's using non-traditional data to act as a control for a study.
And I think that's really interesting approach. I agree with both what you're saying with the challenge as well as what Aaron said. I think one thing I just wanted to be clear, a lot of people when they hear real world data think so much about, EHR claims, registry data, data already collected. I think, what we have seen too is that while those things are great, sometimes there's some limitations because there's such fixed variables and information that you can get from those, which may not give you what you need for the full control arm to go to compare against the live arm. So trying to look at prospective studies as well to collect information and maybe merge them with the EHR or other data to give you a kind of a hybrid look at from a data perspective of an external control arm.
Great.
Excellent.
If I can add to that, so I think this is all exactly aligned in our thought processes around kind of the use case or even broadening our views on the use case. A couple of other pieces to add to this. One is what's the purpose or the audience of that use case? And so certainly that will kind of drive it, whether we're using an external control arm as comparator to a single arm clinical trial as one example for the purposes of submission for a regulatory agency decision-making on a brand new drug approval versus even label expansion type approvals. But even to broaden our horizons, because I think most often we would think of this as a regulatory driven purpose, and yet there's certainly other audiences that this type of comparative analysis would be useful for, including payers and providers and patients and beyond. And so as Dan was saying, expanding our views on the use case, and I would say expanding our views on the audience and the purpose that we're using these use cases for.
Great. Yeah, so certainly expanding the definition both on the use case side and on what kind of data can be used for an external control arm. So let's call it external control arm going forward, and then maybe we can talk specifically about what we mean with certain use cases. So speaking of use cases, I'd love for this group to chime in on what use cases an external control arm would be appropriate for. Where is it necessary? Where is it best? And can we talk even about therapeutic areas? We see some questions that have come up in particular about oncology here.
Sure, I can start if you want me to, Vera,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a number of use cases, and I'll just stick with one to begin with, and it does apply to some parts of oncology, obviously. And the use cases Aaron was saying around clinical trials, I think it's especially important for an external control arm for a clinical trial is when you have an issue with patient sample size. And because why it's so important in the clinical trial space is some of the biggest reasons for delays in clinical trials is patient recruitment. And when you're trying to recruit for a phase 2 or phase 3 trial where you've got to recruit not only a live arm, but also a control arm, that just doubles the amount of patients you need. And when you're looking at rare diseases, certain oncology indications and some of the targeted therapies that are being done for oncology, you run into issues with finding the patients, and you can use other data, other external real world data to help kind of alleviate some of that pain to find new patients to work from.
Yeah, I agree with Tom. I think that rare diseases and oncology is certainly the starting point and the most obvious point for external control arms. We're being asked increasingly outside of those areas whether it might be applicable. And certainly when people want to understand subgroups, they want to have power to look at scientific questions that may not be possible financially or even to implement in an RCT. I think there's opportunity there. The regulatory agencies are still working through what's acceptable. I think there's a strong pushback on using external control arms just to save money. I think that where there's a scientific question that can't be answered, where it's just infeasible, there's a lot of support there. And I think there's a large gray middle ground in between. And we as a group, I think, are all working through what is possible and what is reasonable scientifically.
Yeah, I agree completely as well. I tend to think of it, and again, if we are thinking of external control arms for the purposes of a regulatory submission in particular, because at the end of the day, the purpose and the audience that we're generating the evidence for will largely drive the answer to this question. But taking that use case and that purpose in particular, I generally think of it as the questions that you would ask yourself around the ability to do that active control arm, as Tom and Dan were mentioning. And couple of parameters that we start to see coming out that help guide us there. Is this disease or indication area have high mortality and morbidity with unmet medical need? In which case you might argue that it is unethical to randomize patients into a placebo or standard of care control arm where there really isn't a solid or well-defined standard of care. And we know that these patients not on treatment are going to have high mortality or morbidity. So once you start to kind of make that decision around whether or not you should even be randomizing patients, and therefore you might be limited in some of these rare conditions to a single arm trial only, then I think you start to take a third piece into account, which is what is your preliminary evidence on the effect size of your drug, and whether or not you, and an example really around that is, do you think that your effect size is large enough that you might be able to get approval on the single arm trial alone, or whether you need supplementary evidence to help support that? How strong of supplementary evidence do you need? And there are varying degrees of supplementary evidence, one being a patient level comparator external control arm to help drive that. So I think those are, as Dan mentioned, I agree that there are other benefits that might be timeline and cost saving and so forth. But I think today the biggest drivers are going to be those ethical considerations. And when you take that into account today, it probably is these rare, kind of well-defined niche oncology patient populations. I'm starting to see a little bit of that into the neurosciences or inflammatory disease states as well. But again, I think much expansion beyond that today is going to be harder. And I think until we get more experience and then more formal guidance from the audience, the regulators, then we'll start to be able to see some expansion into other indications down the road.
Yeah, I've seen use cases in neuroscience. We have 2 projects in neuroscience right now, and in immunology and inflammation. I look at some of the questions coming up, and Todd Young asks what type of endpoints are realistically achievable in oncology. I heard only survival, not response rates or progression-free survival. And this gets to the heart of what use cases are possible. I look at this, and we've certainly been asked to do progression-free survival. It's the challenge is that when the regulatory agencies are looking at these studies, it's a real-world evidence application when it's used as routinely collected data, and there's certainly a favoring of hard endpoints, and hard endpoints like survival. In this case, if you want to look at progression-free survival, there just isn't a structured data element there. It's harder to know. I wouldn't call it a soft endpoint. We do studies with soft endpoints, like migraine. Is the migraine getting worse? Things like this. But progression-free survival isn't a soft endpoint. It's just harder to get at. And so you need to either apply a lot of people to the record to know, or you need to apply very advanced technology to the record to know. And I would say those things are well within the realm of possible right now for the firms that are doing pretty advanced work. And we certainly do that. But I would say it's in the realm of hard.
Are there any proxy endpoints in the real world that can be used, like when taken together, to get as close to a progression-free survival endpoint?
I get asked this a lot, and I'll give a blunt answer to this. The proxy endpoints, when we try to put together claims to give a predictive model of what's happening, unless you get a very good fit on that, I don't tend to favor it.
Yeah.
It tends to be biased, and it tends to give questionable validity. On the other hand, to have people reading a record or a machine reading a record, if you can get high accuracy extraction, you can know disease-free or progression-free survival. You know whether someone survives, and you can see the radiology to know whether the cancer has progressed. So I would favor a more direct review over a proxy endpoint.
Yeah, and I think on that point, I agree totally, Dan. And to that point, I know that, again, use cases, it all depends on the use case, but let's take the regulatory use case for a clinical trial. I think you'd have a difficult time convincing the FDA that a proxy could replace a primary endpoint. It'd be very difficult. Maybe be able to do it in some other use cases, but in the regulatory, no.
And I think that's a reflection of I think what the audience is hearing is our conservative, I think, approach to saying today, I think of this as we have to have a pretty high threshold of acceptance. We have to have a pretty high expectation of assessing the quality of data, the origins of the data, and so forth. And that might evolve over time as certain proxies or surrogates become, as Dan was mentioning, show that it's a strong fit, and as we get more experience down the road. But I think today we need to kind of take that purpose and that use case, whatever study we're looking at, really break that down into how is the clinical trial defining these endpoints and these inclusion exclusion criteria, covariates for matching the patient population and the endpoints. And then how confident can we be in being able to find equivalent measures in real world data sources? And I think, Dan, you even mentioned that directly. I have an experience, or you mentioned radiology. I have an experience in looking at response rate, an overall response rate as a primary endpoint in such a study. And defining response to treatment is a challenging thing in real world data, as I'm sure many of us have experienced. And in this particular indication, the way the trial was defining response to treatment was based on radiographic evidence, very distinctly measured. And so even the radiology reports weren't necessarily going to be good enough. And in some cases, we may have to go actually read images and so forth. And frankly, in some cases, we may not be able to find an appropriate fit for a particular endpoint.
Aaron, and that's such a good point. We've been asked also to go into DICOM images to do direct analysis. And we find that mostly in the realm of infeasible. So the question was, can you do progression-free survival in as much as you can get the information required from a radiology narrative? I think that's in the realm of feasible. In as much as you have to go into the DICOM, yes, it's doable. There are plenty of people that create deep learning systems to analyze radiology records. And there are certainly technologies to integrate and move DICOM images. It's just, it gets to the point where it's so hard and so expensive that most of the time it's not going to be worth it.
Mhm.
But Aaron, you may have had experience where you can actually implement it. If so, I very much compliment you, because I find even doing the radiology notes hard.
Yeah, at a small scale, I agree with you. Start to scale it up larger, it becomes very challenging.
Very, yeah.
So I see a series of questions, including one from Ali here, talking about the limitation of synthetic data, real world data that can be collected. If we were to imagine a little bit, what would you have to believe to say that 5 years from now, external control arms are used 10x more than they're used today? What would you want to see in the real world data to make that more feasible?
I'm gonna oh, go ahead, Aaron, go first.
Oh yeah, no, thank you. Just my thoughts on that, because I am hopeful. I probably am more on that optimistic side of the future use of external control arms. And so my belief is that we use these examples where, as we already mentioned before, kind of relatively restricted potential or accepted use cases today. And the more we as an industry become experienced with it and see the value and can see the results in these use cases, we can, or indications, I should say, we can then start to see that expansion. I feel like it's a bit of more of a change management type of thing than it is a technical or analytic thing. Although to our previous conversation, there are certainly technical limitations that we'll have to kind of see advance or evolve. I personally feel like this is more of a, we become more familiar with this, the regulatory agencies or other audiences like payers and providers and so forth also can start to become more familiar and comfortable with the methodology as we get more experience with it.
Yeah, I agree totally, Aaron, but I also want to add on that I'm wondering whether, I'm curious to people's opinion on this. For example, coming now with access to all this great Cerner data and being able to work and potentially control what we can pull out of EHR and what we can convince that can get added into EHR, the EMR process, is I'm wondering if you're going to start to see more of, again, sticking with the regulatory side, are people going to, number one, start maybe designing trials with the external control arm in mind, and knowing the endpoints, whatever, to try to make those be something that's realistic to capture, as long as it doesn't obviously ruin the full trial. And then number two, kind of, I see this kind of a stepladder thing, that as the EMR companies start to see what is needed for that they can kind of up their game and be able to collect the data that's needed to do that. So if we can stage that up, maybe sometime we have accurate enough data that we can rely on the retrospective data, such as that's collected already, to do it. I'd like to hear people's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess when I'm looking at what's required to make this happen more, I guess I would take a step back and say, well, how do we achieve validity? Like,
Mhm.
We worked so hard in the US to get 21st Century Cures Act passed. I was in congressional testimony on that, so I saw how hard the legislators worked to get that passed. And then that opened the door for FDA to say, let's use real world evidence. And the expectation is that we, the people on this call, the 129 people here, will be good stewards of evidence. I think that the US government is hoping we'll be good stewards of evidence, that we will use this in a scientifically valid way, that will promote good science, high validity, reasonable methodology. I think that if we can achieve that, it'll get used more and more. Versus if it starts to be seen as a way to get out of doing good science, then it won't.
Yeah.
So Vera, I think that at a very high level, that's how I'd answer your question. What would it take to get this used more? Is that we're good stewards of science. How hard is it to really focus on high validity and good evidence? We do it in RCTs all the time. We invest huge amounts. And yet there are so many of these other RWE type efforts, including external control arms, that are done kind of quick and dirty. I don't think that has any role in an external control arm used for a regulatory agency.
Agreed.
Oh yeah, I agree with that, Dan. I think while we both alluded to, or I've even mentioned the fact that there are other benefits that can be perceived, certainly around cost and timeline and so forth. If we can keep in mind the scientific nature and really focus on that, which is why I kind of led off where I was discussing saying, the ethical decisions around doing a single arm clinical trial versus the kind of operational considerations, and then ensure that as we assess the data we need and data sources we might be able to leverage to meet those needs really from a scientific perspective, then we get more and more experience with that. That'll kind of help drive this down the road. I noticed a couple of questions, both Dirk and Esther, asking a bit about how many of these have been done so far. And there isn't, so I've actually looked into this as a I don't know, almost on like my free time a little bit to kind of figure this out a little bit. And there aren't clear stats on this, but from what we are seeing, so Esther, there are about a dozen or so examples that I have seen where a real world data-based external control arm was used as a patient level comparison to a single arm clinical trial, submitted as supplementary evidence in one case, primary evidence, but it got moved to supplementary evidence to support first-time drug approval. So there are those examples, but like I said, I've really only seen about maybe 10 to at most a dozen that I could find since 2017. The first one that I found was a drug approved in April of 2017, so that might give you a little timeline. But other than that, I'm sure, and I've seen and heard of examples where they're used for label expansion type use cases, and I don't know what the numbers are in that sense.
Aaron, I know, happen to know Esther, so I know she's from Europe. Do you know, just curious on that as well, if you've done the research, how much do you think that's happened in the EMA and
yeah, fair. I've only looked at the FDA, so that's a good point.
Okay, I'm just curious. Yeah, I'm not saying that was her question, but
yeah.
It feels certainly that starting with an indication expansion where there's already been, a randomized trial in the past feels like the safer way to start exploring external control arms. But what I'm hearing from the group is if this is done well, if this is done in a scientifically sound way, we'll be able to see a lot more, novel indications that get approved with an external control arm.
I think I'd add a quick thought to that too. We're right now, we're again kind of focusing on this idea of replacing the control arm completely with an external control. So you have the single arm clinical trial, as I keep referencing, or we keep referencing, and yet there's a spectrum to this that we can consider, and we could see that, I think, advancing, again, ensuring the right scientific validity and mindset behind it, where we might see examples in 3 to 5 years of other indications with larger patient populations that don't necessarily fit that rarity conditions we mentioned earlier, but maybe it's reducing the burden of the active control with an external control, but there's still some level of randomization occurring, or other kind of spectrums, as Dan was even alluding to, around the use of external control arm beyond this kind of one scenario where we could see that maybe advancing quicker, and then the kind of more single arm clinical trial with an external control kind of following suit as that evidence and experience becomes more pervasive.
So we've talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to slightly switch gears and talk about the operationalization, the implementation of external control arms with real world data. We have a couple of questions on this. So Sean asked, what do you do to avoid some of the pitfalls of, let's say, using retrospective data, get more data points? Is there a bias if we're getting more complete data for some patients versus others? How does this group think of that?
We're asked that question all the time. And the core of the question is more data better? And the answer is, if the data is low quality, then twice as much data doesn't give you a clearer answer. So the focus on this kind of application should be high validity. The ways to achieve high validity is to get data richness and proven data accuracy. That's what we see when people are questioning the validity of the data in this kind of application. Let me tackle those independently. For richness, what we're looking for is clinical phenotype, associated symptoms, and linkage to things like outcomes. It's typically EHR plus claims plus perhaps a registry like a death registry. And of course, this is why Datavant is kind enough to host this kind of webinar, is they're a leader in linkage. And I think that's needed to get that level of richness. We certainly work with them, and I think getting that level of richness is critical. The other aspect of richness, in getting the phenotype, it needs to be believable. So you probably need to dive in, not just into the structured data, but into the narrative. We see that every time in the oncology use cases. And I think as we leave oncology, that's going to increasingly be the expectation as well. You just need the rich information. And knowing that claims data has 50% or more missingness for many of the key disease states, I just don't think it meets the threshold requirements for what would be considered research grade or regulatory grade. So now you're looking at either putting people onto chart abstraction. We're using technology, which is, we've seen natural language processing applied. We've seen inference applied. I will tell you that natural language processing alone is usually insufficient. And the way people are getting around that is to just not check the accuracy. And that will also be insufficient over time. So the protocol should include what we would consider deep phenotyping, which is using the unstructured data and testing the accuracy of your extraction, and what we would consider linkage, which is bringing in pharmacy claims, facility claims, and registries. On the other side of it, proof of accuracy, I think it goes without saying that you should check. It's easy enough to check. The reason people don't check is usually when they check, they find it's bad, which creates a cycle where you should make it better. So you can enrich data to achieve accuracy according to your protocol. We consider that fitness for purpose, and it should be in every good protocol at this point. That's my soapbox, but I'll hand it to the rest of the group.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, let me throw in a couple things. Totally agree with what Dan's saying, and the linkage part is so important, because the chances of you finding everything you need in a single data set is very slim. And to be clear, I think it is important to understand what data do you need for this. I mean, I think you've got to be looking at, for example, inclusion-exclusion criteria, making sure at least the primary pieces of the inclusion-exclusion criteria are included. You've got to look at what the endpoints of the trial are. But then besides those, you still have to look at somehow you're going to have to match these patients who are in the that are in the live arm with your retrospective or real world data based trial. So you've got to be able to collect a lot of data, at least from a primary, the primary pieces of that data, to be able to find that, which is always a challenge. And as Dan was saying, and it's got to be complete and scientifically accurate. I think the one area that we've seen come up more is as we're doing a rare oncology case right now where we are also collecting, because you're going to see certain endpoints and information that you're just not going to find, whether it be patient-reported outcomes or other pieces that you have to collect in a prospective manner. So we're looking at ways to be able to potentially link the retrospective data, which we certainly technically can do, with the prospective data of collecting PROs from these patients to help support that.
Yeah, I agree completely. I feel like we are on this kind of cycle in the industry over the last even 10 years and expanding forward. 10 years ago, I was actively supporting the licensing of data sources for pharmacoepi and outcomes research type analyses. And the number of questions we were always asking was how many patients, how many patients? It was more about sample size. And in many ways, and there are appropriate methodology in epidemiology and statistics for leveraging larger sample sizes to overcome inherent biases or confounding that exist in these data sources. And I agree completely that we recognize that there is no single perfect data source, and it will require bringing a lot of data together in different disparate ways to kind of overcome some of this. And so, yeah, traditionally, and even continue, there are appropriate ways of leveraging larger sample sizes to overcome some of those challenges for certain types of research questions and research projects. When we're talking about a patient level comparison of external control arms, and again, talking about the audience and the kind of purpose why we're generating this evidence to help make decisions around bringing a new drug to market, or even expanding the label of that new drug, I think the scientific kind of expectations are just naturally and appropriately higher. And therefore, what Dan and Tom were talking about the level of completeness is key. I say that not only because we understand and believe this, but also in the example that the example that I've already referenced before. An FDA team specifically required this. And in the public notes review files afterwards, they're very open in saying that they were willing to sacrifice power, reducing sample size by requiring only complete cases be allowed to even be considered to be matched against the trial arm. So from a real world data perspective, we had to kind of broaden our vision of different data sources, bringing them together, linking them appropriately, and so forth at the top of the funnel to ultimately have sufficient number of complete cases at the bottom of our funnel, such that we could even then match a one-to-one type of comparative analysis. And this kind of even fits in for Declan's question in the Q&A there around kind of different teams and so forth. I think because today the regulatory agencies don't have clear and consistent guidance on this. Sponsors are dealing with individual teams assigned to that particular submission. And therefore, each team may have a different way in which they look at what's acceptable to them for that particular indication, that particular drug that is being reviewed, and what their expectation is. And in this case, that team is the one that required a one-to-one complete case matching.
I think that's so important, and I think what it also emphasizes is we don't know. This is so new that we don't know all the time what the FDA or the EMA is going to accept at this stage. So I think it's critical, and we recommend to any clients we have, any sponsors who are looking at this, that you get in front of someone in your regulatory agency as quickly as you can to kind of confirm whatever you're looking to do, whatever your methodology is, that it is something they would accept at some level. The sooner you do that as you're planning your trial, I feel is the better you're going to be in collecting it.
I'll put out a good word for FDA here. Full disclosure, we are funded by FDA in some of our work, but we've really been impressed with their capabilities. Dr. Abernathy, when she came in, brought a wealth of experience in understanding these kinds of data. And when we look at the groups in CEDAR, in EPI, and real world evidence and policy, they have a robust understanding of data quality, fitness for purpose, and the science behind this. It's true that the individual therapeutic areas may not have as much experience, but in general, there's oversight and collaboration from the leadership in FDA in these studies. And if you haven't seen it, you can ask for it. But there's a pretty solid understanding of what's going on here.
Right.
Yeah, we certainly, like, in the past, I would say 5 years, there's been quite, and since you mentioned earlier 21st Century Cures Act, there's been quite the enthusiasm for using more real world data to generate real world evidence. And certainly I think, it goes both ways. So sponsors, analytics companies look to regulators, but regulators also look to the academic world, to sponsors, to analytics companies for just-in-time learnings and for collaborating on those best practices. So very much looking forward to what the next couple of years will bring. But before we kind of like talk about the future, I wanted to focus on a couple of niche external control arm questions that we have here. One in particular around what additional considerations do we need to take when we're focusing on studies that look at special populations? So geriatric, pediatric population, pregnant women.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think certainly there are those other parameters we mentioned earlier around the indication of focus that can drive some of the decision-making around using the external control arm. Certainly when we start to think about special populations, the additional consideration that certainly brings to my mind is the availability and of data in the real-world data settings on those special patient populations, where some of that data is also protected even beyond the normal protections around patient privacy and confidentiality. And so then adding that additional consideration, certainly in data around pediatric populations, some of the challenges for pregnancy that come to mind are things like linkages between the mother and the child that may be of particular relevance for certain pregnancy-driven clinical research studies. And so I think that is a great question that kind of bears not only on the one end of the purpose and whether or not external control arm is the right fit for a given audience, like the regulators, but also on the back end, considering the data sources we might leverage and to what extent those data sources can even cover well some of those special patient populations and what is, I guess, more available to us in the life sciences and research world.
I'd break this into two areas: the consented collection of real world evidence or real world data versus the non-consented. On the consented side, I think you need to use the full rigor of what you would use in an RCT in terms of protections of patient populations. I don't think there's any difference there. On the unconsented side, I think you get into issues of, I think you have the usual privacy and security issues. You have to meet the strict definition of de-identification, whether it's a safe harbor or an expert determination method. On the expert determination method, you'll find it a little harder because it's a protected patient population. I think that you're going to need to show a lack of re-identifiability. I think that everyone is going to be sensitive to those issues. So it's true we're asked in like pregnant patient populations for linkage to children, and of course we know how to work with a firm like Datavant to make sure that we're doing it right. But we would be responsible for the de-identification, the protocol assurance of non-re-identifiability, and the basic data protections that any group like that would have. So I think it is important to work with a very experienced group when doing those kind of studies.
I'll add an additional thought there, and I saw the question in the Q&A that kind of moved on now, but around even considering prospective versus retrospective. I know right now, or so far, we've been talking about this from the concept of a prospective clinical trial and using retrospective data sources, but there are certainly considerations beyond that. And at the end of the day, you know, we take the purpose, what are we trying to generate the evidence for, the use case, you know, and drive back to what are our data needs. And we've certainly talked about that so far. And then really kind of keep our minds open to the potential data sources and not just limiting, I know we've already mentioned this, not just limiting our mindset to EHR and claims per se. Certainly the Kantar Health experiences around direct to patient type of engagements and collecting data that way. But I would also pose even making considerations around historical versus contemporaneous type of impact. So certain medical conditions, the way in which patients are treated obviously changes over time. And so if we go back retrospectively, we might be looking at an uncomparable patient population, even if they do match on inclusion and exclusion criteria, just because of the way in which patients were diagnosed, were assessed, were treated. Clinical guidelines of assessments change over time. A new treatment comes to market that might impact it. So we need to keep that in mind around maybe we need to look at a more recent time period, or maybe we need to do our real world evidence type of assessment in a prospective way contemporaneously with our clinical trial assessment because of those impacts. And at the same time, we also need to consider things like potential site bias. So when we really think about some of these rare conditions, there may not be well accepted, well-defined clinical guidelines on some of these conditions. And therefore, where the patient is treated may have an impact significantly on that patient's health outcomes. And so we might need to consider that as well, and whether or not we need to collect real world data from the same sites as where we're running the clinical trial to overcome potential site bias. So there are a lot of considerations that need to come in. And I think my overall kind of message with this comment is keeping our minds open to all of these considerations and not just thinking of external EHR or retrospective EHR and claims data alone.
Yep. Totally agree, Aaron. And to answer Josh's specific thing around prospective data, that yes, it is a challenge. There's no question. And yes, consent is almost entirely required, of course, for that. So to get it in scale can be difficult. But for example, Kantar Health, there's companies that do that, and Kantar Health is one of those. But there's other companies that can do that. And there's really no other way to get at the prospective data in a way that can be accurately captured.
I'll give an example of another type of prospective study. So let's say that you have a retrospective study that looks at a patient population pre-launch and does deep phenotyping and linkage and gets high validity analysis, whether for external control arm or other function. Now let's say you launch. You want to use the same system to prospectively collect data. We've seen that happen a lot to create a pragmatic registry, which is as rich as you would see otherwise, but obviously not the price point of a consented registry. So there are options there on prospective. It needs to be done. I couldn't agree more with Tom that it needs to be done in a very careful way. And it needs to be done typically with close relationships with health systems, regulatory agencies, and such. But there are ways to protocol studies that are very good in privacy and security and get very rich and highly valid data.
Agreed.
So as we're getting towards the close of the end of the hour, I wanted this group to kind of look in your crystal ball and curious to see, do you foresee any innovations either on the technical side, on the technology side, or on the operational side that will drastically change the way we think about external control arms in the future? And if no, why not?
So I'll jump in with a couple of thoughts. And again, I've already mentioned earlier, I tend to be more on the optimistic side of the scale in terms of the future potential of external control arms. And I recognize that. I think, as I mentioned earlier as well, I think the bigger things to impact the acceptance of external control arms are going to be around ensuring we continue to drive scientific validity, as Dan mentioned, and also around the kind of experience, certainly recognizing the kind of risk averse, I should say, nature of the industry, conservative nature of the audiences that the evidence is being generated for. I think it's going to be more around change management and kind of experience with high scientifically rigorous type examples to help kind of overcome some of the barriers to opening this up further. But from a technical perspective, the couple of areas that I am hopeful to see more and more are going to be around getting at or the ability to leverage more detailed data points, data variables, if you will. And most specific, I'm thinking of the actual radiology images, pathology images, some of the genomic and genetic data details that I know there are companies out there looking to solve these challenges. And I agree with Dan, it is a challenging thing to do at scale, but if and as we can overcome some of those and get some of that richness of data linked to other data sets that we have available today, I think that'll start to open it up technically as well.
I agree with that. I think I'll focus on that piece too, because I totally to add on what Aaron said around that. It's also hopefully getting the EMRs to have that much more artificial intelligence to built into. There's always a struggle of the notes and all the PDFs that are there, et cetera, being able to read those in a privacy compliant way, which is so important. But being able to make our way through it, there's been a lot of progress made in that, but there's still a long way to go. And I think being able to pull data from whatever sources are in there in the EMR, whether it be images, whether it be PDFs, whether it be actual just notes, in a privacy compliant way to get statistically accurate information out is going to be is to me the next stage of this.
I couldn't agree with that more. And I would say that as we do in everything else in healthcare, we measure how good we are at doing it. So there's a feedback loop. We check, are we good at it? If we're not good, we do something to make it better. And we haven't yet added that into our real world evidence protocols to say, okay, we pulled the information out, were we good? And we so often see that missingness creates bias where sicker patients have better documentation. And so making sure that we don't allow so much missingness, making sure that when we pull the information, we're not being sloppy about it, I think is an important next step in enabling highly rich, highly valid real world data and evidence.
So as I'm hearing this conversation, there's certainly for me a lot of interesting takeaways. So the way I see it, external control arms are here to stay. There's certain use cases and certain therapeutic areas where they're being used today, and then there will be more growth. And perhaps depending on what data is available and how we think about external control arms, more can be done in the future. But what I'm hearing here is good science is definitely prevalent and number one. Engaging with regulators is key. Trying to think about external control arms a bit more broadly than just the standard, a comparator to a single arm will be interesting. And trying to bring data that is complete and as free of bias as possible. So certainly a lot of work to be done in the next decade or so, but I'm very excited to see where the industry goes. And then with experts like the group that we have in the panel here today, I'm very much looking forward to see all of the future innovation. Wanted to thank the attendees for all of the questions today. And in particular, I see that a couple of folks are becoming part of the Q&A by answering some of the questions, which I very much appreciate. We did not get to all the questions today, but we will try to reach out to you offline to answer some of these. Wanted to make sure to thank our esteemed panel today. Aaron, Dan, Tom, thanks so much for the time and for your insights. And wanted to make sure that I wished everybody good health and a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you, Datavant.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.